Lena Carter had spent years dreaming of this moment. Her own art studio filled with the scent of fresh paint, the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the large window, and the quiet hum of creativity in the air. It had taken her months to set up this space on the human Exilarian colony, balancing between her artistic passion and the rigid expectations of alien society. But now, standing before a blank canvas, she felt nothing but peace. That peace, however, was shattered the moment the door slid open with a sharp hiss, and the towering figure of Grand Matriarch Silva stepped inside. The air in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the Exilarian elder examined the studio with narrowed, reptilian eyes. Her silver scales gleamed under the artificial light, her posture rigid with the kind of authority that needed no words to be understood. Lena's heart clenched in her chest. She had known this visit would happen eventually, but she hadn't expected it so soon or so unannounced. Silva was not just any Exilarian. She was the mother of Lena's husband, Ralvek, a decorated warrior and one of the most respected figures in their militaristic society. And she had made it very clear from the beginning that she did not approve of her son marrying a human, especially one who wasted her time on what she called meaningless strokes of color. Silva's gaze swept across the studio, lingering on the canvases propped against the walls. Some were finished, depicting the wild landscapes of the Exilarian homeworld, their jagged cliffs and burning red skies captured in delicate shades of blue and violet. Others were mere sketches, outlines of stories waiting to be told. But instead of appreciation, Silva's expression darkened, her sharp jaw tightening as if she had just walked into a battlefield unprepared. "This is how you spend your time," she finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of disapproval. "Smearing colors on fabric instead of learning the ways of discipline?" Lena clenched her fists, forcing herself to remain calm. She had dealt with critics before, but none had ever carried the authority of a Exilarian matriarch. She had expected skepticism, maybe even disdain, but she had not expected outright hostility. "Art isn't meaningless," Lena said, keeping her voice steady. "It's a way of understanding, of expressing things words can't." Silva let out a low, guttural sound, something between a scoff and a growl. "Expression does not win wars. It does not protect your people. It is weakness disguised as creation." She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her tall frame casting a shadow over Lena's smaller, human form. "Do you know what real women do in my culture?" She didn't wait for an answer. "They train. They sharpen their minds and bodies. They lead warriors into battle. They do not sit in rooms splattering paint like children." Lena felt the sting of the words, but refused to let them show. "I am not Exilarian," she said simply, meeting the matriarch's gaze. "And this is my studio. My work." The silence that followed was heavy, an invisible battle being fought between them. Lena knew she was challenging not just Silva's beliefs, but centuries of ingrained culture. Exilarians did not value art. They valued conquest, strategy, and discipline. To them, creativity was an indulgence, something for the weak. And Lena was starting to realize that in Silva's eyes, she was not just a disappointment, she was a failure. Before she could say anything more, the studio door hissed open again, and Ralvek stepped in. His deep blue skin was marked with the scars of past battles, but his golden eyes softened the moment they landed on Lena. He had always been her greatest supporter, the one who stood between her and the harsh judgments of his people. But now, seeing his mother standing in the middle of Lena's sanctuary, his expression tensed. "Mother," he greeted cautiously, stepping between them as if sensing the rising tension. "I was not expecting you so soon." "I came to see what my son has chosen to bind himself to," Silva said, her tone icy. "And I am disappointed." Lena felt Ralvek stiffen beside her, but before he could speak, Silva turned sharply on her heel. "This is not over," she said, casting one last look at the paintings as if they personally offended her. "Our Exilarian household should not be tainted by such weakness." Then, without another word, she strode out, leaving only the faint scent of metal and war in her wake. Lena exhaled slowly, realizing only then that her hands were trembling. Ralvek reached for her, his touch warm and grounding, but she shook her head. She had expected resistance from his people, But she had not expected his mother to outright condemn her passion. And if she had learned anything from the look in Silva's eyes, it was that this was not just about her art. This was a battle. And it was far from over. Lena had always believed that art was untouchable, a sanctuary where the harshness of the world could not reach her. But that belief shattered the moment she stepped into her studio and saw what had been done. The scent of fresh paint, once comforting, was now mixed with something sharp and bitter, the stench of destruction. Her heart pounded violently against her ribs as she took in the chaos before her. Every canvas, every sculpture, every carefully crafted piece of work lay in ruins. Shredded paintings hung limply from their frames like torn fabric, their vibrant colors reduced to meaningless streaks of destruction. The sculptures she had spent weeks perfecting were nothing but piles of shattered fragments, broken beyond repair. Even the brushes and palettes were scattered across the floor, their bristles bent and their colors smeared into a sickening mess. It was not an accident. It was deliberate, and Lena knew exactly who was responsible. Her hands trembled as she stepped forward, each movement slow, careful, as if she were walking through a graveyard of her own making. The silence in the room was deafening, pressing down on her like a weight she could not lift. She wanted to scream, to rage, to demand why, but the answer was already clear. This was a message, a warning, a declaration that her art, her passion, had no place here. She swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump forming in her throat, but the devastation in front of her made it impossible. A cold voice shattered the silence. "You should not have defied me." Lena turned sharply, her eyes locking onto the towering figure standing in the doorway. Grand Matriarch Silva stood there with the same unreadable expression she always wore, but there was something else in her gaze, now something unmistakable. Satisfaction. Lena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You did this," she said, her voice low but steady. She would not let this woman see her break. Silva stepped forward, her armored boots crushing a broken paintbrush underfoot as she walked further into the wreckage. "Real women do not waste time on meaningless pursuits," she said, her tone as cold as steel. "I warned you. Art does not make you strong. It does not prepare you for the realities of life. And yet, you insisted on clinging to this weakness." She gestured toward the ruined paintings as if they were nothing more than trash to be discarded. "So I removed the distraction for you." Lena's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. She had never known hatred like this before, never felt such a deep and consuming fire burning within her. Her art had always been a part of her soul, the one thing that made her feel whole, and now it had been ripped away as if it had never mattered. And worst of all, the person who had done this stood before her without an ounce of regret. The sheer arrogance, the cruelty of it, made her stomach twist. "You think you've won?" she said, her voice shaking, but not from fear. "You think this will make me stop?" Silva let out a low, unimpressed hum, as if she'd already decided Lena's words meant nothing. "It does not matter what you think," she said. "My son may have chosen you, but that does not mean you belong here. You do not understand our ways. You do not understand what it means to be strong. And you never will." A sharp pain struck Lena's chest, but she refused to show it. She refused to let Silva see how deep her words cut. "Strength isn't just about war," she shot back. "It's about standing for something, even when people like you try to tear it down." She took a step closer, refusing to let the matriarch's towering presence intimidate her. "And I will rebuild everything you destroyed." Silva tilted her head slightly, as if amused by Lena's defiance. "Then I will destroy it again." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, cold and absolute. For the first time since meeting her, Lena realized the full weight of what she was up against. This was not just a battle over art. It was a battle of cultures, of ideals, of what it meant to be worthy in the eyes of the Excelarians. And in Silva's mind, Lena was not. She was an outsider, a weakling, a foolish human clinging to something that had no place in a warrior's world. The sound of hurried footsteps broke through the tension, and Ralvek appeared in the doorway, his golden eyes widening in horror as he took in the destruction. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice sharp with concern. But the moment his gaze landed on his mother, understanding dawned on his face. Silva did not look at him. Her attention remained on Lena, as if waiting for her to break, to surrender. But Lena met her gaze with unwavering determination. She would not let this woman destroy her, no matter how much power she thought she had. Ralveg turned to his mother, his expression unreadable. "You did this?" Silva finally acknowledged him, but her expression remained indifferent. "I did what was necessary." Something in Ralveg's face hardened. He took a slow step forward, placing himself between Lena and his mother, as if shielding her from an invisible attack. "This is not our way," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. "We do not break things simply because we do not understand them." Silva's expression flickered for a fraction of a second, so fast that Lena almost missed it. But then the cold mask returned. "You are too soft," she said. "You always have been." Ralvek did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned to Lena, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Regret? Apology? Pain? He reached out, his fingers brushing against her hand, a silent reassurance that he was still with her. But Lena didn't need his comfort. Not now. She would cry later, in the quiet of the night when no one could see. But here, in this moment, she refused to give Silva the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. Taking a deep breath, Lena straightened her spine and met the matriarch's gaze one last time. "You can destroy my studio," she said, voice steady. "You can tear apart my work. But you will never take this from me." She tapped a finger against her temple. "Everything I create starts here. And as long as I'm breathing, you will never erase it." For a long moment, Silva said nothing. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she turned on her heel and walked away. Lena watched her leave, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Silva had declared war on her art, and if the matriarch thought Lena would simply back down, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. Lena had never been the kind of person to back down from a fight, but this was unlike any battle she had faced before. The destruction of her studio had left her shaken but not broken. If anything, it had only strengthened her resolve. Silva thought she could erase Lena's passion with brute force, but she had underestimated the one thing Lena had always carried in her heart: determination. The moment the matriarch walked away, Lena knew this was no longer just about her art. It was about proving that strength came in more forms than just war and combat. It was about showing Silva, and every other Exilarian who believed the same, that creativity was not weakness. And so, Lena made a decision. She would not simply rebuild her studio. She would challenge everything Silva believed in. The next morning, the colony was alive with activity, but for once, Lena was not painting. Instead, she was in the heart of the Exilarian training grounds, a place she had never dared to step foot in before. It was a massive, open-air arena, filled with warriors sparring under the blazing sun. The air smelled of sweat and steel, the sounds of combat ringing through the space like an unspoken anthem of strength. Exilarians moved with precision, their bodies trained for war from birth, their every movement a display of discipline and power. Lena felt every pair of alien eyes settle on her the moment she entered, curiosity and amusement flickering across their expressions. A human in their training grounds was an anomaly, a sight they did not expect. But Lena ignored them all. She had come here for one reason. Silva stood at the center of the arena, overseeing a group of young warriors as they practiced their forms. When she turned and saw Lena standing at the entrance, her silver eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. But Lena did not wait for an invitation. She stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her resolve unshaken. "You wanted me to understand your culture?" she said, loud enough for everyone around them to hear. "Then show me." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered warriors. Some laughed, others whispered in their guttural Exilarian tongue, their amusement clear. A human challenging the Grand Matriarch? It was absurd. Impossible. And yet, Silva did not laugh. Instead, she studied Lena with the same cold, calculating gaze she always carried. "You do not belong here," she said, her voice as sharp as a blade. Lena lifted her chin. Then teach me. Silva's lips pressed into a thin line, as if considering whether Lena's challenge was even worth acknowledging. You are not a warrior, she said finally. You cannot wield a blade, and you do not understand combat. Why should I waste my time? Lena took another step forward, her hands tightening into fists. Because you don't respect me, she said. You think I'm weak because I create instead of destroy. You think strength only comes from battle. So prove it. Train me. Let me stand in your world the way you stood in mine when you destroyed my studio. Her voice did not waver, even as she felt the weight of 100 warriors' eyes on her. You wanted me to understand what it means to be Xelarian? Then stop running and show me. The arena fell into a tense silence. Even Rolvek, who had followed her here in stunned disbelief, said nothing. He had tried to stop her from coming, warning her that his mother would never accept such a request. But Lena had not listened. And now, she stood before the Grand Matriarch, waiting for her answer. For a long moment, Silva did not move. Then, slowly, she tilted her head, something unreadable flickering in her eyes. You are either very brave, she said, or very foolish. Lena held her ground. Maybe both. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Silva's face. Very well, she said. If you wish to understand our ways, then you will train like one of us. But know this, human, there is no mercy in our training. There is no room for weakness. She stepped closer, her towering figure casting a long shadow over Lena. You will bleed. You will fall. And when you do, I will not pick you up. Lena swallowed, but she did not look away. Then, I'll stand up on my own. The warriors surrounding them let out low murmurs, some intrigued, others clearly doubting her. But Silva did not speak again. Instead, she turned on her heel and gestured for Lena to follow. The message was clear. Training started now. Rolvek stepped beside her, his voice low and urgent. You don't have to do this, he said, concern etched into his features. She's testing you, Lena. She's trying to break you. Lena exhaled slowly, her heart still hammering in her chest. Then I won't break. And with that, she followed Silva into the heart of the training grounds, stepping into a world where she did not belong, a world she was about to fight her way into. Lena had never felt pain like this before. Every muscle in her body ached, her arms and legs bruised from endless drills, and her hands, once so steady with a paintbrush, now trembled from exhaustion. Training under Silva was worse than she had imagined. There were no easy lessons, no moments of rest. Every failure was met with a cold stare, every hesitation punished by another round of relentless sparring. The Xelarians did not train for sport, they trained for survival. And Lena was an outsider who had dared to challenge their ways. They watched her with curiosity at first, expecting her to quit, waiting for the inevitable moment when she would break. But she did not. Day after day, she returned to the training grounds, her body screaming in protest, but her heart refusing to yield. She learned how to hold a Xelarian blade, how to move with precision, how to anticipate an opponent's attack. She fell more times than she could count, hitting the hard ground with enough force to knock the wind out of her lungs. But each time, she forced herself back up, gritting her teeth against the pain, determined to prove that she was more than just a fragile human. Silva never praised her, never acknowledged the effort she put in. But Lena could see something in the matriarch's eyes, something that was no longer just contempt. But no matter how much she trained, no matter how much she learned, she knew one thing would never change. She was not a warrior, not in the way they wanted her to be. She could fight, she could endure, but her strength would never come from a blade. It came from something else. And when she finally realized what she had to do, everything became clear. One evening, after another brutal day of training, Lena stood in the ruined remains of her art studio. The destruction Silva had caused was still there, shattered sculptures, torn canvases, broken brushes. But in the center of it all, buried beneath the wreckage, was a single blank canvas. Untouched. Waiting, a slow breath escaped her lips. She knew what she had to do. She spent the entire night painting, her hands moving with a purpose she had not felt in weeks. The bruises on her fingers throbbed, but she ignored the pain. Every stroke of her brush was deliberate, every color carefully chosen. She painted the battles she had seen, the warriors who had trained beside her, the raw intensity of their movements. She painted the rage, the discipline, the unity they carried in their hearts. But most of all, she painted the truth, the emotion behind the war, the depth beneath the violence. When dawn arrived, the painting was complete. She carried it straight to the training grounds, stepping into the heart of the Xelarian world with her creation in hand. The warriors who had watched her struggle for weeks now turned to her with confusion as she moved past them, walking directly to Silva. The Grand Matriarch stood tall, her silver eyes narrowing as Lena approached. She was expecting another challenge, another attempt to prove herself in combat. But Lena did not raise a weapon. Instead, she lifted the painting and placed it before her. Silva's gaze flickered with something unreadable as she looked down at the canvas. And then, for the first time, Lena saw something she had never expected to see. The great matriarch hesitated. The painting was unlike anything the Xelarians had ever seen. It captured war in its purest form, not just as battle, but as a story. Every stroke of color carried movement, every shape carried emotion. The warriors were not just faceless figures, they were living, breathing beings, their eyes burning with the weight of the lives they carried. And at the center of it all was Silva herself, standing amidst the chaos, not as a cold, unyielding ruler, but as a leader who bore the burden of every warrior under her command. A heavy silence fell over the training grounds. The warriors, who had once mocked Lena's art, now stared at the painting with something close to reverence. Because for the first time, they saw themselves not just as fighters, but as something more. Silva finally looked up, her gaze locking onto Lena's. The matriarch's voice was quiet, almost lost in the stillness. This is how you see us. Lena met her eyes without hesitation. This is what you are. Another silence stretched between them, but this time, it was different. Silva's expression was unreadable, but there was no longer the same coldness, no longer the same certainty that Lena was weak. Instead, there was something else. Something Lena had never thought she would see. Respect. The Grand Matriarch did not speak, did not praise, did not apologize. But she did something far more powerful. She turned, facing the gathered warriors, and after a long pause, she nodded. A single nod. A silent acknowledgement that Lena had won a battle no blade could fight. Lena had never expected peace, not with Silva. But after that moment in the training grounds, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a glance that lingered a little longer, a warrior stopping to watch her paint instead of dismissing her presence. The hostility had not vanished, but something had cracked through the walls they had built. Even Silva, who had once destroyed her studio without hesitation, had not spoken a single word against her since that day. The painting had done what no battle could. It had forced them to see beyond their own traditions. But the universe was not kind enough to let that moment last. The attack came without warning. Lena had been in her newly rebuilt studio, surrounded by fresh canvases and untouched paints, when the alarm shattered the quiet. A deep, resonant sound echoed across the colony, the kind that sent immediate fear crawling through the bones of everyone who heard it. It was not a drill. It was not a test. The Xelarians, who were always so composed, erupted into motion with terrifying speed. War was second nature to them, and within seconds, the colony was transformed. Warriors rushed to their posts, weapons drawn, voices barking orders in their guttural tongue. The sky, once a brilliant shade of deep blue, was now filled with the shadows of approaching enemy ships. Lena barely had time to react before Ralvek appeared at her door, his expression grim. "You need to leave." Now, her heart pounded. "What's happening?" Ralvek's jaw tightened. "The Vortalians. They found us." Lena felt the blood drain from her face. She had heard of the Vortalians, even though the Xelarians rarely spoke of them. A brutal, war-hardened race, they were one of the few species that could rival the Xelarians in battle. And they were merciless. The Xelarian colony was not just under attack, it was under siege. But Lena did not run. Instead, she grabbed the one thing she could carry, her painting. The same painting that had made Silva pause. The same painting that had made warriors rethink their views of battle. Because deep in her heart, she knew this was not just an invasion. It was a test. By the time she reached the outer walls, the battle had already begun. The sky was filled with streaks of energy blasts, explosions lighting up the horizon as Xelarians and Vertalians clashed in midair. The ground rumbled with the force of the conflict, and the scent of burning metal filled Lena's lungs. It was chaos, and in the center of it all stood Silva. The Grand Matriarch was a force of nature, her twin blades cutting through the enemy with brutal efficiency. She moved like a storm, every step precise, every strike deadly. But even she was outnumbered. The Vertalians had come prepared. And for the first time, Lena saw something she had never seen before. Silva was losing. A massive Vertalian warrior, easily twice her size, barreled toward her, a monstrous weapon raised high. Silva turned, too late to stop the blow. Lena didn't think. She moved. Her feet carried her forward before logic could stop her, her hands clutching the only thing she had, the painting. And just as the Vertalian swung, she lifted it high, the canvas absorbing the impact meant for Silva. The force of the blow sent her sprawling, the painting ripping apart as she hit the ground hard. Pain shot through her, her vision blurring, but she forced herself to look up. The Vertalian had hesitated, not because of her, but because of what he had seen. The image of the battle, the raw emotion, the undeniable truth painted into every stroke. For a fraction of a second, the battlefield was still, and in that second, Silva moved. Her blades struck true, and the Vertalian fell. Lena coughed, pain searing through her ribs, but she barely noticed. Because when she turned, she saw something she would never forget. Silva, the unshakable, the untouchable, the warrior who had once destroyed her art without a second thought, was kneeling beside her. "You are a fool," Silva said, her voice unreadable. But there was something else in her expression, something that looked dangerously close to respect. Lena managed a weak smile. Maybe the battle raged on, but something had changed. The Xelarians fought harder, fiercer, no longer just warriors, but something more. And Lena, broken painting at her side, realized the unthinkable had happened. She had won.